When John was up here earlier this morning, he asked for all of the entrepreneurs in the room to raise their hand, and the entire place raised their hand from my viewpoint. I'm curious, you've had a long entrepreneurial career. Can you give us a brief overview of that and how you ended up at G2?
Yes. So I have been building companies for 25 years. I think 23 years companies that I really started. So I think my first company I started back at the beginning of the .com era. And I just was training interns at G2 yesterday. And I realized, didn't even know what that was. So it was a long time ago. But and then I built one company, Big Machines, which eventually was a long struggle. It was a .com baby that then almost died. And but eventually it was a success. It was acquired by Oracle. And we built another company, SteelBrick. Also, they were both sales quoting software, CPQ. And we sold that to Salesforce. And that experience inspired G2 because I was been a software entrepreneur, and frankly, I thought it was way too hard to buy and sell software. And that's why we started G2. Yeah. And so now, we've been building that for over 10 years. And so I've been building companies forever, and I do also love helping other entrepreneurs. So now I'm also an angel investor, chairman of a couple other startups that our entrepreneurial family are building. So I do love entrepreneurship, love building companies.
Yeah. And somewhere along the way, you ran into this concept of conscious leadership. How did that show up? Who were you early on? And you told me a fun story the other day that inspired the moving on from rage piece of the title here. So I'm curious if you can share that with us.
Yes. And I first got on the conscious leadership. I wasn't looking for it. But I remember my first company, Big Machines, in 2008, we started having success. And I joined this organization called YPO, Young Presidents Organization, which I still love. And if your company that's at scale, I'd recommend it. But I remember I joined YPO, and then they recommended I join a forum. And a lot of you might know what a forum is, but basically meet with 8 fellow, and at the time we were all fairly young. Well, they define it loosely. I think young is under 50. But I think I was like 37 at the time when I joined my forum. And there were some older CEOs, entrepreneurs. And frankly, I remember thinking, I'm like, I don't know if I want to do this forum thing, because you meet like once a month for 4 hours. And I'm like, man, I'm too busy for that.
Yeah.
And my life already feels way too stressful. And like sitting down for 4 hours, I'm like, I don't know. Then I remember I had this one older forum member, Jordan Dorfman, still a good friend of mine in Chicago. He ran Chicago Meat, very different business, but he just put his hand on my shoulder, looked at me.
Yeah.
Just like, Godard, we can help you.
Help you from what?
I don't know.
About
I didn't
what?
know.
Yeah.
I had no idea, but I kind of believed Jordan.
Yeah.
And Jordan in my forum, luckily for me, they'd been working on conscious leadership for a long time. And they'd been working with coaches, actually including Jim Dethmer, even I think back to Jim Warner. I don't know if Caleb Warner's here, but like they'd been working with conscious leadership coaches for like a decade. And I think what Jordan sensed in me, I was just filled with anxiety, fear, doubt. And my first company, and I guess my story why, we did, financial statements did say we almost failed because we raised 20 million in the first year, burned through 19 million first 3 years, and we were basically almost bankrupt. We were just going straight to bankruptcy.
Wow. And
it felt terrible. It's my first company. I also recruited my dad as my first customer and my first investor. And my dad had also been an entrepreneur growing up. He was in pump manufacturing. And so Big Machines was inspired. We were going to help him sell his big pumps online. And but I think my worst fear, my grandfather started the company. He wanted me to go in the pump business. But my worst fear growing up, I was going to be like that third generation entrepreneur, where it's like nepotism and then you ruin it. Like 2 generations of hard work. And honestly, I was about to do that. And luckily, it wasn't all my dad's money, but it felt like that. And then also, like, I recruited my best friends from MIT to join me in the company. And I was like ruining their careers. I was ruining my career.
It's a lot of pressure.
It was just like failure, failure, failure. Yeah. And then during that time, luckily I married my wife, Stacy. We've been married 20 years now. And that was probably a highlight of those years. Not probably, it was a highlight of those years. But then we also decided to start having kids. And then I remember I was at work and Stacy and I think she took a home pregnancy test. Like I kind of knew she was pregnant. And I was at work, like some busy meeting. And anyway, she's like calling my phone during a meeting. I'm like, oh, I know she's just calling to confirm the pregnancy, whatever. I'm gonna stay in my meeting.
Ooh.
I don't know if any other entrepreneurs here do that. I was very obsessed about my business. But then I finally called her back, and she's like, I'm like, yeah, like, how's the doctor? Just expecting her, yeah, I'm pregnant. I'm like, great, okay. But then she's like, no, there were 2 heartbeats. I'm like, what do you mean? And she said, that's what she said to the doctor. Like, 2 heartbeats, is that normal? Turned out we were having twins.
Yeah.
And which was also wonderful. But then I also remember, like, our life seemingly got harder because, like, I think like 24 weeks into the pregnancy, all of a sudden Stacy went for a checkup. And I think luckily I went with her to that one, but all of a sudden the doctor was just like, bed rest, bed rest. We're like, what do you mean? I think this doctor was an 8. She wasn't there was not much Susie in her. And, but turned out Stacy was showing symptoms of premature labor. So she went on bed rest at home. And then I think 27 weeks we went into the hospital. We were living in Chicago, I remember Prentice Hospital. And I was sleeping on the couch with her in the hospital. And that was a very scary time because I remember reading all the statistics, like all the things that go wrong. I never even thought about, like, I think I always assumed as a parent, oh, my baby will be like normal, right? And but then you see all the risks of premature birth. And then, luckily I think we made it to like 30 weeks and 5 days. And but then our boys were born premature. They were in a NICU. Spent several weeks in a NICU. It's a very scary place. I don't know if any of you have been there, but your babies are like hooked up to all these wires and beeping. And I do remember what was special that time. You get the kangaroo care for your babies, hold them on your chest. And I just remember that, especially my son Gavin. And now he's actually going to go to the University of Colorado.
So, woo, go Buffs.
So, the end of this story, yes, go Buffs. Coach Prime, I love Coach Prime. Who loves Coach Prime? Coach Prime's my new idol. I want to meet him. Coach Prime's also a great entrepreneur, great brand builder. But I love Coach Prime. I'm going to meet him. And but anyway, at the time, Gavin was like this little, but it was a really scary time. And I just remember like one day, and then my company was also really failing. And I remember, felt like it was failing. We did kind of to make the company survive. We cut the company from 70 to 20 people. And then my co-founder and I, like, we just got to sell enough to become profitable within a year because we weren't going to be able to raise more money because our business, frankly, all the metrics looked terrible. So we're like, the only way we're going to survive is we make more money. And then I remember we had this key customer meeting in southern Wisconsin, this manufacturer. And anyway, we were counting. We were going to go see the president of this business, Don Canterna. And this was like right around the same time. I think that maybe the boys were just coming home with Stacy, and we also weren't sleeping, so that's probably why I don't really remember. But anyway, like I remember we were driving up to the reception at this place in Delavan, Wisconsin, and we're like, oh, like going up to the reception, like, oh, we're here to see Don, the president. We're really excited for this meeting. We've been preparing for months. We sold like kind of a sister company. We're like, oh, this is gonna be our big deal to like save our year. And the reception's like, oh, it's funny, Don's not here today. We're like, what do you mean? We have a meeting with him. He's like, oh, he's not here. Good luck to you. We're like, fuck. But then I remember I was driving back to Chicago, back to the hospital to see Stacy and our infants in the NICU, and I was just like, oh. I just remember I had this thought, like at this moment, like my life just felt so heavy. I'm like, my life cannot get any worse. Like, my boys are in the NICU, who knows if they're gonna make it. Company's failing, like everything's failing.
Yeah.
That felt like, but then actually, right after that moment, I just remember like, I almost felt like some relief. Because once I like accepted all of it, like I'm like, oh, it can only get better.
Just actually saying it.
Yeah, and just feeling the despair and just feeling it all the way through, but then some like shifting to acceptance.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, well, I was like, the only good news, I'm like, it can't get any worse. And then from that moment, my life only got better. And like I said, my boys grew up well. The business eventually got better, but way long story back to conscious leadership. But that feeling didn't really leave me. And at the time, I was dealing with my anxiety kind of by stuffing. I think conscious leadership term, but stuffing myself with too much food. And then the way I'd get relief, even with like my work friends, we'd go out, drink too much, get drunk.
Just more and more and more and more.
Yeah, because I get this, like it felt like a storm cloud of anxiety in my company. And even when I was home with Stacy and our twins, and then we had our daughter 3 years later, even when I was home with the kids, I couldn't stop thinking about work.
Yeah.
It was just like, it was like this horrible compulsion, this storm cloud literally in my forehead. And the only way I could deal with it, yeah, and the one healthy thing, I did keep running, but I like eat too much, drink too much. I remember I'd be like midnight, I'd just be like eating cereal, and I'd try to work. So I was like, felt so compulsively to working, I'd just like eat cereal and then like crash on the couch, not brush my teeth. So I was just like taking horrible care of myself and felt full of anxiety. Eventually the company started succeeding. And some of that was fun. We did start growing, and eventually we got to a great exit, sold the company for $400 million, so that turned out good in that way. But then back to YPO, I met these guys, and I was very skeptical. And then we had an offsite, and I remember I met our first conscious leadership coach. I think it was Jim Kachalka. And then the next year was Jim Deathmer. And I was just the biggest pain in the ass to them. And later I also did the Enneagram. I'm an 8. I'm a challenger. And so I just challenged him relentlessly because I'd be like, Jim, this is all bullshit, Like my life is so effing stressful. But I somehow got curious. And Jim actually would just laugh. He knew how to deal with me, the disruptive 8 in the group. And but then eventually I was intrigued. And a lot of them had hired him as a coach. I hired Jim Deathmer as my coach. And one of the funny things I remember at the time, I was very ROI driven, but I had breakfast with him next to our office. And I'm like, Jim, this coaching stuff sounds great, but he charged a lot of money. And I'm like, well, how am I getting an ROI on this? And he just laughed. And he's like, but it's $7,000 a day. I'm like, okay, wow. I'm in. But because I didn't know what I was looking for. And obviously, that's like a great sales technique now. So our investors are like, prove ROI. I'm like, I just laugh at my customer and they buy. I'm not that good of a salesperson yet.
Yeah.
But anyway, then Jim, and I remember our first coaching sessions, I think like most conscious coaches do, they start with presencing and meditating. And he took me through a guided breathing. And it was 5 minutes long. At the end of it, I remember I felt very relieved. The storm cloud felt like it lifted. But I just felt tired, I was just sagging in my chair, and I'm like, Jim, this is great, but how am I ever gonna get work done? I just want to go to sleep.
Where's that ROI? Let's go.
Yeah, I'm just gonna go to sleep, and I'm not gonna build my company. I just want to sleep. And then Jim laughed again, and he's just like, oh, this is very normal. Yeah. Because I was so fueled by fear, anxiety, and doubt. And fleeing from fear and fleeing from failure. And that drove me, and that was my motivation, my energy. I was also drinking 6 Diet Cokes a day, another unhealthy thing to do. And but I was just fueled by anxiety, caffeine, and then I'd relieve it, too much food, alcohol, kind of just go over an edge to relieve myself of that anxiety. And that didn't really work because the next morning I woke up, the anxiety was still there. So then with Jim, and it took a couple of years, and then the funny story you're alluding to, a few years later, I actually kind of Bart, I don't know if I ever want to admit it, I kind of got nudged out of my first company. I sold 51% to a private equity firm. And because this was 10 years, and we started having success, and I wanted some money. I wanted my investors to have some money. So I knew what I was doing, my mind was okay, if I sell 51%, I'm selling my baby. It felt like a human baby. I do think the best entrepreneurship analogy for people who have been entrepreneurs is parenting. It was like a baby, right? It does feel that emotional. It cries at night. Eventually it grows up and gets more independent.
But for a while it just shits everywhere?
Yes. And there's no one to help you, right? You got to wipe up all the poop. You got to feed the damn thing.
Yep.
No employees can do anything. You got to do it all. Fucking baby. Just go to sleep.
Especially with your 8 challenger show strength,
yeah.
Push all the time.
Right. And you can do every job better, obviously. But so anyway, where was I? I lost my train of thought. So but anyway, I did this deal, 51%. It was actually a pretty good deal. We made good money. And then also before the deal, the investors were like, oh, you know what you're doing. And I thought I knew what I was doing. I'm like, yeah, I fucking know what I'm doing. And sorry for the swearing. Is swearing unconscious?
Are you aware of it?
I tell the story, I enjoy it at times. To convey passion and rage. It's a very quiet setting. So sometimes screaming is fun. But where was I?
Your first camp experience.
Yes, and then, so I did, but anyway, one board meeting in, I got in a huge fight in a board meeting. I remember one of our board members then from this investment firm, he'd worked for Microsoft, and then our company was getting bigger. We're at 50 million ARR, and he's like, have you run a company this big, Godard? I'm like, no. And then he's like, well, I'm not sure you know what you're doing. I don't know if those were his words, that's what it sounded like. And then I was thinking, I'm like, you work for effing Monopoly. You're in the Caribbean taking orders for Microsoft Word. How freaking hard is that, dude? Anyway, so it didn't go well with the investors. And then I think it was mutual. I don't know, but I agreed to step down as CEO because and it felt very traumatic because my identity, my ego was the company. And And thinking once I started having success too, my ego loved it. They're like, oh, you're now a brilliant entrepreneur. I got in like the Chicago Entrepreneurship Hall of Fame. I'm like, this feels good. And then my ego was forced away from that. And then they paid me for years as senior advisor, which seemed financially good. But I remember I was like home, and my friends didn't know. Was like my friends in my Chicago suburb. They're like, "What's wrong with you?" Like, because like you can play golf whenever you want, you make good money, you're getting paid to do nothing. What's the effing problem?
Perfect life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I was like depressed, and I was the good thing is my kids were little. I was taking them to elementary school in the morning. And the only constructive thing I would do all day was like P90X, so I did start to get my physical health back. But I remember I was just barely could get out of bed to take my kids to school. And I'd read the Wall Street Journal in my home office, fall asleep, wake up on my couch. I'm like, okay, you got to go work out, but I had like no energy. And my wife, after a few months, she's like, what's wrong with you? And Stacy, luckily, very supportive wife. But then I kind of realized, oh, wow, I miss entrepreneurship. But then during that time, I also, in that year when I was kind of wallowing, having lost my company, I decided to go to this, because I'd been working with Jim, and they do these conscious leadership retreats. I went to one in Florida on the beach. And it's like a 2-day thing. You pay for it, right? And it's like 20 people. Some of you have probably been to these conscious leadership type forums. Beautiful place. And I think on day one, I remember Sue was there. Sue Hallbrunner was also my coach. Where's Sue?
She's over there.
Yes. And, but it was Jim and Diana, Jim Dethmer, Diana Chapman, like the 2 Uber coaches. And they were running this group together. And somehow, and I'd been working with Jim, and I think somehow Diana just annoyed me. And Diana's an 8. So one of the things I decided to do in the middle of this, and Sue, you remember it, who knows what's true, but I decided to go try to sit between them. And they didn't like that.
But you were as important as they were.
I thought so. I thought I was more important. And I want to get in between them, Diana. I don't even remember why or what, but I was just feeling a lot of rage and anger. And I just wanted to challenge everything Diana said, and I was. And I think it was unconstructive. I mean, I felt like a lot of rage and energy, and I thought Diana and I were in a good 8-on-8 debate. But then, and I did this a couple times, and then eventually Diana was just like, you must leave this retreat.
And what happened to your rage in that moment, Godard?
It didn't go away. But luckily, I did walk out of the room, and then I just laid on my bed, and honestly felt horrible. But the funny thing is, if you've read the Conscious Leadership book, a couple years later, Diana called me. She's like, can I include this story in the book? And she's like, and I'll rename you Sarah, I think. But that story is in the book.
Yeah.
And then what I felt more rage about when I read it, I was like, that's fine. But then at the end of it, and I did a clearing with this Diana many years later, because I had resentment about it for 7 years. But at the end of it, I judge it to be her last sentence was Sarah will be an abject failure. This is the example of why unconsciousness leads to complete and utter failure. Sarah will fail. And I was just like, F you, Diana. Anyway, that's how I read it. And I think if you read the words, I don't think they actually say that. And I did a clearing 8 years later with Diana. And anyway, because I kind of made her the villain. Jim I love, so Jim was and I'm he's a victim of Diana's bullying. I was a victim. I don't know, but I was really on the triangle. Huh. So that was, and that's how Sue and honestly, Sue also really annoyed me. And I annoyed Sue, I think, because Sue was also in some weird 8 state, I think, in her life. And anyway, but then funny enough, many years later, Sue's been my coach now at G2, I think since 2019. So eventually, it's funny, and I don't even think in those years we ever spoke. But then when I was looking for a coach, all of a sudden Sue and I reconnected, and she's been a wonderful coach and friend to me ever since. But it's just a funny way that we met.
Yeah. So I'm curious, because anger and rage seem to be a core persona of yours.
Yes, I'm good at that. Vlada was up here last. She's like, I don't like anger. I love anger.
Yeah.
Let's have some tension, baby.
As my Peacemaker 9 just was like, oh shit,
yeah.
No.
I do have a 9 wing. It's okay, Keith.
It's okay.
Bring it in.
But it's still there. I imagine it still occurs to you on a daily basis.
Yes.
Anger as an emotion shows up. I'm curious how you use that as a superpower for good when you can and when you're aware of it, or how your approach to processing anger has changed over the years.
To me, I think this whole conscious leadership game is like about awareness, right? Feeling it more. And I think Vlad also says it's feeling it physically, and feeling the rage, because it can be like heat and sweat. Like, it feels like that.
Yeah.
And I think what I'm working on, and also with Preeti Patel, now our Chief People Officer G2, also been a conscious leadership coach. But Preeti also says, she said to me, Godard, she's like, hey, because Jim Dethmer also models anger really well. Have any of you been with Jim? But obviously brilliant conscious leadership. Kind of like I consider him like a guru. But I think the difference, like when he expresses anger, it's like about him, like he's feeling it, but he's not directing it at you. And so I think that's my goal now with anger. If I can just feel it. And actually I did this morning in my pool, I just screamed outside. And I now live in Boulder. My neighbor probably thinks I'm freaking crazy. But like it feels really good. And just to like feel it for myself and let it energize me. But the goal being not to direct it at others. And the bad anger that Nate does, like I bully people because I just want my way.
Yeah.
And then I'll just kind of bludgeon you. And luckily it's not physical, but like with words.
Yeah.
And I'll just browbeat you into doing what I want. And it can, it works. Like I get what I want, but there's a lot of residue. But for me, because afterwards I feel really sad and guilty for like days, right? There's a big hangover for me, and I believe for the other person, maybe even worse, especially when I'm their boss. So there's a lot of like emotional residue, and then I do think it burns people out. Burns myself out. And at the end of my first company, I felt very burned out, like extremely burned out. Just from like kind of living from a below the line space so much. And I think since then, the companies I've built, second, third, like it's felt like a lot more joy, a lot more ease. I still feel anger and rage, but I think I can feel more of the other emotions, joy. I can feel some Susie. And, but I think what I've also learned, and I believe our emotions are all like the same pipes. And I do think that's a problem, like in America, like all I want is joy, and I'll medicate away my anger, I'll medicate away my sadness. Sometimes with real medicine, sometimes with drugs, alcohol, or just avoidance, stuffing with food, right? We find all these ways to avoid the emotions we don't want, because all I want is that joy. And I love joy, but I think I'm more like, I think my mental theory now is I'm optimizing more for aliveness and like feel them all, feel them equally.
Yeah.
And then I can feel more alive, have more energy, create more. And anger is also part of nature. And I have to think about this like with storms. And nature is usually peaceful, but there's like horrendous thunderstorms, there's hurricanes, there's tornadoes, right? At times nature, if you consider that God is also violent and angry, but most of the time peaceful, lovely, sunny.
Yeah.
And so I want to feel all of it.
That's awesome. Left turn into tactical for a minute. G2 recently raised $157 million. You had a huge piece in that. How is being a conscious entrepreneur, how did that help in that process? Or did you see it enable conversations, or was it just not a piece of those discussions?
I do think indirectly, because I do think overall being a more conscious leader makes me a more effective leader.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things I loved about working with Sue, looking at her, my team really loves it. Because I think what Sue points out, we can go 8 on 8, but she also shows the team like I can be challenged, and that's okay.
Yeah.
And but I feel like it's made my team more comfortable, more productive. So I certainly think it's had that impact. Although some part of me also says like investors also like the 8, and I probably also have all the stereotypical like advantages, like relatively tall, white male, went to Stanford, MIT. So I kind of have all the, like makes it easier to raise money. That's also true. And somewhat they like you being a cocky a-hole at times. Mm-hmm. Investors, my story, they like false confidence, and I'm good at projecting false confidence. So it can be useful also. And actually in total we raised $257 million. And across all the companies we raised almost $500 million. And so I do like raising money. And but if you've watched Silicon Valley, have you watched that show? Yes? Mm-hmm. And I love that show. I actually think they nailed it. I used to live in Palo Alto where it's filmed. Actually, one of my favorite scenes, they're like driving around, they're like funny. This just looks like a really shitty neighborhood. And my wife and I, we lived in Chicago. I'm like, yeah, it looks like Deerfield, Illinois, nice suburb, but like, except the houses cost 20 times more.
Yeah.
I'm digressing, but the whole, they represent that dynamic well of the investor. And a lot of it is probably my story, it's below the line. Matt McCall's also here trying to change that. But like, and that, there's that really funny scene of how to raise money, right? And the more you insult the investors, the more they like you. And Matt may not have missed this, but I think most VCs, it's true. They kind of want you to bludgeon them. And my eight's glad to do it.
Something I picked up in the language you used in the last few minutes is my story. I'm curious if you can give us a little bit of a taste of why you use that language. Because it's something that's often done in the conscious leadership world, but I know it's different for everybody, and I'm curious about your perspective on fact and story and how that shows up.
Right. And Keith also coaches our team at G2.
Yeah.
And it is something I've learned from Keith, Sue, Jim, conscious leadership coaches. Because by saying my story, because I think most things, my thoughts, I've also learned like our minds, right? It's like this train of stuff, my mind speaking. But it's all just like stories that could be BS. You know, it's just my perception.
Yeah.
And just like I talked about in the book, you know, that Jim and Diana wrote, like I made up this story of what Diana said. And then like when I read the words, I'm like, oh, the paper says something different, but my story is so true. But it's just my story. You know, it's also true about human perception. And I also believe, yes, we're all one. I love that session earlier. We're all one. We're all connected. And we also there's something like we come in different flavors. We have different stories. So it's a helpful term to just, rather than me saying it like, Keith, I know this to be true, right? It's a fact. Like I'm just saying, hey, Keith, this is the way I remember that story.
This is the thought that I'm having, or
Yeah.
this is the experience that I'm bringing to it.
Right, and hopefully that makes you like, especially if I'm like the boss versus if I come to you, Keith, like this is true.
Yeah.
Then I think my sense is it's harder for you to react and be open.
Yeah.
And if I just say, hey, this is just the story that's going through my mind.
Well, and on my end, just hearing it, verbalizing that gives me the opportunity to go, oh, he's not just making a fact-based statement. There is a little bit of a window for me to push back if I don't totally agree or if I have a different perspective. And as a rage avoider over here, those are really helpful things for me because I can now feel some freedom to go, oh no, actually, since you said it's a story, I experienced that a little bit differently. So I appreciate it showing up in your language.
Oh, thank you.
It's great. We have 2 minutes left.
Okay. Should we scream? We've had a lot of silent time. How about a group screaming?
Little group scream.
Mix up the silence. Let
do
your
it?
anger flow.
This is going to be weird. All right, everybody stand up.
Are we going to do it? Why not?
Let's do it.
All right.
Oh, it's Boulder. We'll be fine. I put shoes on just for this event, so we're good.
I hope there's not a prospective student tour.
Find that place where you have anger or feelings. You know, maybe you want to scream in joy. You can do that, but let's get some shit out. Yeah?
All right.
You want to count us down?
Sure. Let me think about something that makes me really mad. All right, are you all ready? Think of your least favorite person, that board member that annoys you the most. Sorry, Matt. I keep picking on Matt. But we all have investors that really piss us off, right? Or somebody. All right. We'll just do a 3, 2, 1.
Yeah.
3, 2, 1. Let your anger flow into the universe.
Experience it. Emotion sits here for 90 seconds or so, and then it moves on.
Yes.
Right?
We'll move beyond the rage
Yeah.
by feeling it and letting it flow. All right. 3, 2, 1. I feel like hot and sweaty. It feels good. Bring it in.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Keith.
Appreciate you.